Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Sorry for the delay due to some technical difficulties. I'm fighting with Zoom. Hopefully that didn't take up too much of your time. I will try to finish up within the allotted time. And just wanted to welcome you all. Thank you very much for joining. I hope I have something to share that you can take away and come away from this webinar with and say, I'm going to just use that every day. My name is Otto Dreissen. I'm an alumnus of the MAPP program at the University of Pennsylvania. I also have a coaching and a consulting practice, which is dedicated to transition. And transition basically being sort of the emotional result of change. That's hopefully a resounding word, a resounding term for you in these days with Corona. And what I want to talk about today is what I call presencing. There are a lot of sort of 3 steps back to getting control over whatever it is, type of messages out there in the face of the Corona outbreak. And now that Corona is here, it almost seems to sort of be more so. There's even more messages of X steps to control and sort of back to normal. What I would like to argue is that we take a look at what I call presencing, which is a combination of sensing and being present. And to do that, in order to make sense of what's going on and to really make sense first of what's going on with ourselves before we move on and go do things different or go back to normal, as some people are wanting as well. I will show you a technique. It's called self-distancing. And this is basically a great technique that I want to present for your emotional well-being in these times of social distancing. So I propose that we self-distance in this time of social distancing. Next slide, please, Sharon. So what we will cover is we'll talk a little bit about what I call the next normal. We'll talk about transitions, how they are structured, and what happens emotionally in them while we're going through them. We'll talk about this presencing thing, sort of the what and the how and the why of presencing, particularly in the light of Corona. And speaking of Corona, COVID-19, we'll look at some transitions that we are all facing and making in these challenging times, collectively and individually. Lastly, I want to do an exercise with you, which I call the observer, which kind of brings home what I've talked about until that point. Next slide, please. So talking about the next normal, some people call it the new normal. I propose we call it the next normal because we don't know if it's new. It's just a next normal. Aren't we blessed to know that this guy from the BBC a little while ago actually sort of unknowingly prepared us all for this next normal? He showed us what it's like to have to deal with, kids at home being rowdy, walking straight through the screen, i.e. the challenges of working from home. Next slide, please. And you might laugh at that, but humor has actually been a really good tool for all of us to get used to sort of the reality of doing things different. We're all working from home. We're all using Zoom. And as this webinar attests to, there's always challenges. There's always technical challenges and snafus. And sometimes we just need to learn to laugh about them. Here, in this case, of course, the ubiquitous screen freeze due to not enough bandwidth being available. It can also be, next slide, it can also just be good to have a joke, and there's plenty of them, about how things might be good and bad. It's a way in which we're kind of dealing with these transitions. And we can't really fully comprehend it, much less control them. But so humor can be a good tool to start to get used to new things. Next slide, please, Sharon. So let's talk a little bit more about transition in detail. As I mentioned, transitions are usually the byproduct of change, how we experience this new normal we're talking about. And just like air travel is forever different since the days of 9/11, we are kind of sensing right now that things are going to be different. We just don't know how. We're thinking there's going to be a loss of normalcy. We're fearing economic toll. Of course, some of us are living this already. We're definitely fearing a loss of connection, even though we do our best via Zoom to correct that. And yeah, this kind of what feels like what is a temporary change, at least we hope, feels really permanent somehow, and that creates unease. Next slide, please. So all transitions have actually a three-part structure to them. There's a before, there's a middle in which the change occurs, and then there's an after. The best known version of this is Kurt Lewin's change process model, but there's also William Bridges. His transition model is really similar to Lewin's. It just adds that it talks a little bit more about this middle phase in which the change really happens. And it proposes that that is a period of confusion on the one hand, but also of introspection and sort of real, almost revolution sometimes. So it's a really difficult, but also a very promising phase. And I think we're kind of feeling that we're almost in that change phase. We're just not quite sure how yet and what it's doing to us. Next slide. So if you look at the cognitive aspect of transition, you actually often see a U curve or an inverted bell curve in which, firstly, sort of the before and the after are the high points. And then there's the change phase, which is usually the low point. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it is a low point. It's not a depression or sort of something inferior. It just means that, yes, a mood might be different. For instance, in models having to do with satisfaction with life, in midlife, oftentimes, which is what I deal with a lot with clients, but also, say, during the day, you might start at a high point and have the sort of the post-lunch lull, and then followed by another energy high point. So the middle phase is usually kind of the low point in that U curve. And then there are these two inflection points. If you click on the slide, Sharon, I'm sorry to that this is going so haphazardly, everybody. That's just due to our technical constraints of today. Then there's these two inflection points, and they really signal sort of the forthcoming change. That might be in the form of an increased awareness within ourselves that something new is coming. And lastly, one more click, Sharon, please. The real change, as I just mentioned, it happens during that low. And that's the presencing phase. That's that presencing that I have been talking about. Next slide, please. And why do I talk about presencing? Because, well, really, as I propose, we are currently approaching that presencing phase. And presencing in the face of challenge has a real potential for positive and lasting change. And so it's important to understand a bit more as to what we can do here. Next slide. So presencing, I would propose, is really about the act of self-distancing, even if in a time of social distancing, and self-distancing being the art of sort of taking a step back and asking why. Why do we do the things in the way we do them? How can we do them differently, perhaps? Or what are our underlying assumptions in all that we do? Almost asking those questions like a fly on the wall, kind of looking at ourselves from a distance and going like, why? And this is useful because Corona has already shown that many of our assumptions are actually not as flawless as we think they are. For instance, the idea of proportionality, sort of, what you put in is what you get out, or if there's a sort of controlled response, then this whole virus will spread itself kind of in a controlled manner. Well, we found out quickly that that's not the case. So Corona is really sort of replacing our linear sense of how things develop normally by exponential models. And so it's really useful to ask these sort of questions. What we can do then is, using presencing and asking these questions, is to really start challenging our underlying assumptions, which might then lead us to start thinking different and hopefully in the end, take different action. It's really a kind of a reflect while you do type of model. Using that sort of fly in the wall, sort of looking at yourself almost from a distance, even though you're still in yourself, is really what it is about. And what that might do in the end, I propose, is that it creates more choice, more freedom, even in the face of limitation. So if you're looking at yourself, you always have an option. If you're sort of your own observer, like a fly in the wall, you always have a choice as to whether what you see there, what you observe, whether you want to be that, i.e. identify with your thoughts or your emotions, or kind of distance yourself from it and go like, huh, I'm just noticing this, and choosing to kind of be disconnected from it. That sort of, that choice is really, particularly in these type of times, can be really quite liberating. Next slide, please. So let's see how this might all play out in sort of COVID-19 times. Next slide, please. If you look at kind of our collective conscience, this is kind of more or less what happens. And maybe you can click sort of, you can click 5 times now, Sharon, in the interest of time. This is really following Otto Scharmer's theory review. What happens is there's kind of 5 phases. They're not necessarily linear, they're not sequential necessarily, but they tend to kind of happen in this order. What first happens is that there's kind of a denial. And we saw this with Corona, sort of, you know, business as usual, please. This was all before, you know, really the stuff hit the fan. Then following that sort of initial denial, there's kind of, that's followed by kind of a shift. We kind of begin to make some changes. We adapt to that next normal, and things are starting to sort of go a little bit different. What really changes things, though, is when we are down in that reframe phase, and we've kind of begun to ask ourselves different questions, and we're already sort of starting to think about things differently, and that's where we are now. The repurposing that happens after that then is really sort of picking up the energy, that energizing sense from seeing how things can be different, and put a common purpose behind it. So things for us right now in repurposing mode, questions are, how can we all beat Corona, obviously, but also kind of new values are emerging. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I'm sure you have actually. Kindness, sort of, we're in it together. That's almost a palpable sort of sense that you can feel in the street. And that's really what happens following a kind of a reframe, whether that be sort of conscientious or not. People start to align differently. And in the end, we can really use the potential of all this and redesign things, redesign the way we go about things, redesign the way we go about treating diseases or viruses or things going forward in the future. But we can also redesign the way we live together and help each other out, for instance. What that will require, and maybe you can do another 5 clicks, please, Sharon, is that we observe, we sense, we self-distance, then we make sense, we crystallize, and we prototype, we try things out. So in the face of our denial, if we say, you know, business as usual, what we really ought to have done is observe really what's going on and draw conclusions that are different than the ones we have. And that really is made possible by the sensing that is below there. So once we do that, that will allow us to do the self-distancing that I just spoke of, and then up the curve again to go on with the crystallizing and the prototyping. To then lastly, 3 more clicks, please, Sharon. Think about, well, what are sort of the different things that are going to make all this possible? At the top end, you'll see sort of at the for the highest level actions there, it'll require an open mind. We will need to use our curiosity. It'll require compassion, opening of our hearts, and we can all see this happening. But even more so, it requires our open will, which is really about having the courage to change things and to look at things differently. Next slide, please. So what might we do for ourselves? The first, if you can click 3 times, Sharon, please. The first thing, it really helps to just kind of take stock of like, well, what of all our plans, all our goals, all the things that we set out to do, what of those have been canceled? And of course, we have adaptive responses. We're going from physical to online. We're going from the outside to inside. We're all sitting in our homes now. But really, the powerful change happens when in the reframe stage, when we start realizing that it's not just the virus that is contagious. Of course, love and caring can be as well. And we can start editing things out of our lives that we don't really need as much anymore to focus on a new thing, a new challenge. And very interestingly, we can also start reframing our strengths. This is an interesting thing to be talking about in positive psychology land. For those not familiar, in positive psychology, we use the concept of strengths quite a bit. And if you can click to the next slide, please, Sharon. We tend to, sorry, one more click, there we go. We tend to want to be in that famous upper right-hand quadrant, our strengths, things we're good at that give us energy. And that is usually the way we see as that's what contributes to our well-being. That's opposed to, for instance, things we're not good at, weaknesses, and that drain our energy. There's also even things that we might be good at, they're called strenuous gifts, but don't really give us energy, so we don't really want to focus on those. But I propose that in these times of reframe, one more click, Sharon, that we actually focus on something else in addition to our strengths. I call these hidden treasures. And I want to give you one quick example of a hidden treasure. I am right now finding out that I'm actually very good at something I never knew or thought about being good at, which is helping seniors. I drive older people. I don't drive them personally anymore. We can't, but I do grocery. I shop groceries for them. I pick up prescriptions. I just help get things done for them. Never realized that I was good at that, but kind of using my sensing, I just signed up for a program. I found I enjoyed it. I wasn't particularly good at it, or I'd never really practiced it before, but it's become a hidden treasure of mine. That's how I am kind of reframing my strengths. And I think it's just one tiny example of how we might all go slightly out of our comfort zone of just being good at something versus, well, there's emerging things that might actually also contribute to society. One more click, please, Sharon. So with that reframe individually, what we might do, one more click, actually two more clicks, Sharon, is we might then, tend to the vulnerable and find a new purpose in that. And ultimately, I mean, that's just a kind of an individual action, which you can choose to do or not do. But wouldn't it be more interesting if you take those types of values and make those our sort of new values of not just us individually, but us all together? There's this famous saying from Malcolm X going around now: "We turns illness into wellness." And I think that's where we can really harness the individual potential of people making individual transitions to amassing those collectively. And that's all great, what we're showing here, but this is still about seeing ourselves as kind of human doings. Let's now lastly look at ourselves as human beings. What if we kind of framed ourselves as real human beings, i.e., what if we were able to reframe our emotions? And that's where I want to do a little exercise with you. It's called the observer. Next slide, please. And the observer is really about looking at our emotional transitions in the face of Corona, for instance. It is about, next slide, please, Sharon. Yes, and if you can click it 5 times, please. So it is really about going within ourselves, using our body to sense kind of the allostatic overload, i.e. our resources being depleted and filling up less with less speed than the demand is out there. It is also about being mindful of the fact that we have multiple selves. We have, for instance, an adult self that takes care of things, but we also have a survival self that we're now tapping into much more than we used to. And there's even such a thing as an overwhelmed self, which is an entirely different state that we can enter in if things really hit the fan. When we start looking at ourselves, particularly within our bodies, we can start noticing things. such as the negative emotions that we have, the self-criticisms perhaps that we might have, things like, all the shoulds, or I am not ... enough, or I'm not doing ... enough. What would really help all of us emotionally is to do an emotional reframe using self-distancing. And what we might find is that we can create choice, like I just said about creating that choice for ourselves. Do we want to be what we're feeling and the emotions that we're seeing, or do we want to just observe those and creating freedom in just that act, and accepting and making room for grief, anxiety, and pain can create an energy, can create kind of a newfound energy in many cases. Lastly, compassion, not beating ourselves up. That can actually reframe who we are, not worthless people, but actually people who have a lot of worthiness, a lot of self-worth, just from being kind to ourselves and of course to others. And that might repurpose us in what we do and what we feel. We might become more values-led. We might feel less anxiety. We might feel less inner turmoil. And gosh, wouldn't it be great if those became kind of emerging patterns for how we do things going forward? And a real simple example of that can be, gosh, I feel negative emotion X because of Corona right now. Perhaps if I really look and observe myself in kind of a fly on the wall way, that reminds me of feelings I've had before, for instance. If I then allow myself to just kind of feel those, see those feelings, kind of almost sniff them out, but not attach those to me, that may give us a lot of power in terms of dealing with anything that comes our way going forward. So lastly, I just want to do one exercise with you. It's a fairly quick one. Next slide, please, Sharon. And it's called the observer. And the observer, in order to do that, I just want you to sit comfortably, hopefully being able to take a few more minutes than we took out for this webinar. We're almost at the 30-minute mark. But in order to do this, I want you to sit on your chair comfortably, pay attention to your breathing, just kind of slow the rhythm down. And firstly, with one click, Sharon, I want you to kind of notice now and also going forward, but in this moment right now, what and how is your body feeling in this moment of sort of the next normal? Take a moment to just kind of observe that. Take stock of your feelings. Feel what's going on there. And imagine you're seeing yourself in this like a neutral observer. You're an observer of yourself. That camera is kind of going around you, and it's doing a scan of you. It's just allowing you to see and feel what is going on. Take a moment to do that. Then secondly, I invite you to now, but also after this webinar is over, perhaps, to kind of reflect on what kind of emotions are coming up and what kind of physical signals are you feeling? Can you put a word on them or a description? And are these things that you tend to kind of depress if they're negatively loaded? Or do you tend to invoke them, i.e. have you had similar feelings or emotions a lot before? And do they come up again? Try and sort of figure out what's going on there and try and see if you can label these things going on. Thirdly, I want you to engage in this practice called self-distancing. So while you're labeling, while you're sort of in that sensing mode, how does it feel to kind of point the flashlight towards yourself instead of what we're used to doing outward? We're doing that internally now. What is it like to be looking at your emotions and your feelings inside your body, almost as if you were an outsider? It tends to give people a sense of power, a sense of, wow, I actually have a choice here. I can look at myself kind of neutrally, or I can look at myself and sort of feel the pain or like identify with what I just labeled in the second item. I have a choice between those two. And I'm not going to say always ignore what you're feeling and just kind of be that neutral observer, but it can help in times like these to kind of edit the negativity out sometimes by knowing that you always have a choice in which you look at things. Fourthly, perhaps you can think about, with this insight, what can you do differently, and how might you go about doing that with this kind of new knowledge that you have, and the choice, the freedom that you've created for yourself. So this could be things like, gosh, I'll go back to my example of working for the elderly. That is associated with a certain emotion that I felt in the wake of Corona really hitting big. What can I do with that? How might I go about doing things in my life differently as a result? And then fifth is the kind of the redesign. So if you have that new power to kind of look at yourself in that different way, is there a new pattern that you can create? Maybe it's just a simple thing like, maybe I'm not going to kind of go off and with this negative emotion and just kind of start yelling at people, or perhaps next time I'll know to do things slightly different. That can be an individual action, and of course at the collective level, if we all do that together, we may create new patterns of reacting to things in society. So hopefully this kind of exercise can take people from a sort of a fear-based or fear-induced energy to a more positive energy state. So what we've gone over is really about what transitions are like, how transitions are now, next slide please, Sharon, how transitions are now lived and sort of thought about, conceived in Corona times. And what I really first and foremost have wanted to show you is that using simple things like self-distancing can really help us not only react to things different, but actually reconceive the way what we do and how we do things going forward. And that's where the potential lies. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your patience also. And I look forward to any questions you might have.
So for anybody who has questions, if you could just type them into the Q&A box that you should see on the bottom or top of your screen, I will be happy to ask Otto for you. That was great, Otto. Really, really interesting. So far, I don't see any questions. Any thoughts, comments you guys want to put in the chat box? Thanks, Otto. We got from Mary Beth. Otto, thank you for this thoughtful session. Nicely done in spite of the tech difficulties.
We're just living what we're living what we preach. So
right. There you go. Elaine wrote, awesome, Otto. I really like the flashlight analogy. Thank you. That's from Krista Marcucci. Here's a question for you, Otto. Why is your company called Live Only Twice? Mary had that question.
It's not completely associated to today's topic, but in a certain way it is. Live Only Twice kind of has at its core the idea of reframing. So in that sense, it does live this presentation. This started actually during MAPP, researching how we develop art in terms of life stages. And a major sort of discovery for me, myself, in that process was exactly that sort of self-distancing. We have a choice the way to see how we look at things and what we do with them. And given many factors, things like we're living longer, given the way our VUCA world is kind of hammering away at us, we not only have a choice, but more often than not, we have a necessity to kind of reinvent ourselves using that reframe, using that self-distancing. That's where the idea of Live Only Twice was born. It literally came from my capstone title for my positive psychology degree, which started with "You only live twice." and then a subtitle, which is related to the idea of reframing.
Otto, you use the term VUCA for VUCA world. Can you tell people what that means?
Sure. Thank you for slowing me down there. VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So it's basically everything that's going on right now in our lives. I think it was the phrase was coined in banking, and it kind of seemed to have stuck. So thank you for stopping me in that.
Yes, we are certainly living in a VUCA world right now. Any other questions or comments? So, wait, any advice for individuals that might be in the midst of a job search right now and staying positive during this challenging time?
Yes, excellent question. And excellent because it's on so many people's minds, right? Not only those who are looking for jobs, but also people who do have a job and are afraid that things might happen. And I think this applies not only to job searching, but actually to a lot of things in life. What I tell people, starting with my clients, but pretty much everyone I meet, is to actually follow this kind of transition model and take it to heart, particularly the observing, the sensing, and the reframing. Those first three kind of stages, I'll keep calling them stages for lack of a better word, because I find that that's where we pay preciously little attention to ourselves, to our world, to our situation. And that kind of constricts us from finding that potential and that opportunity that might be where we think it is, but oftentimes it's in a different place. And we need to kind of ready ourselves to see that possibility and to find that opportunity in perhaps different areas than you thought before. So my advice would really be to start with kind of the foundation of that observing, sort of what, and it might just be tracking your life story. What are the things that you have denied? Speaking of denial, what are the things you have denied in your own development or never paid much attention to? Have you noticed any sort of shifts, both in your own development and sort of how you have gone about your work? All these things, it's really about, a lot is about narrativity, sort of creating your own story about life and perhaps doing some reframing in the process. I would start with that sort of foundation. And particularly now, because we're all going to have to do that exercise. It's almost an identity story about who we are, what we can add to the world, where our value is or might be, because it might be in a different place going forward than we thought it was not so long ago. And what are sort of the cognitive tools that can help us to really explore those new options and that possibility.
Excellent. The next question is a combination of comment and question from Elaine. That's great. You are continuing to help seniors. Appreciate your body inclusion models. Otto, what do you do at home to keep up your well-being?
What do I do to keep up my well-being? I do several things. I have learned almost from never having done it before to really start paying attention to my own body. This may surprise you, but I come from a long tradition of just never ever paying attention to whether I'm hungry, whether my muscles are sore, whether I'm tired. I always had the physical capability to just keep going, and that's what I did. And I found out in more ways than one that that's just not at all a good way to do. So I've really started to pay attention to that. These days, in Corona days with social distancing, I take a lot of walks with our dog, particularly. We go on a lot of walks together, have a lot of fun. Things like bike riding, but that's particularly to Corona. So there's that physical aspect. And then there is the way I try to stay fresh sort of in my mind is really to read a lot of stories and also just interact with people, try to interact with people that I haven't interacted with before. That's kind of my challenge at the moment. That for me is really what contributes to my well-being at present.
Fantastic. And then the last question, and this one could take some time to answer, so I'm going to suggest that you pick maybe your top 2 or 3 points. And the question is, what benefits did you get by being an alum from the positive psychology program at Penn? I mean, other than meeting me, of course.
Well, that would that's what I would start with, Sharon. Thank you very much for coming up with my number one. The benefits from being a MAPP alumni, there are actually several. I really believe that what we are doing right here, right now, is kind of the biggest benefit of being a MAPP alum. There is just there are about 500 of us, and the richness, the sense of purpose that we have, particularly in times like these, is something that is just an endless source of energy. And I mean that not for just saying it, I mean that really, it's palpable. We do a lot of, we keep in touch, Sharon can attest to this, through various means. And that's how initiatives like this are born very quickly, not for wanting to be smart, looking good. No, it's for really caring, deeply, deeply caring about not just our own well-being, but about other people's well-being. So that, to me, would be sort of the top reason. The other reason to be proud as a MAPP alum, this is a bit more personal, but after having spent a lot of years in kind of what I call me-centered professions, so think management consultant, think architecture to some degree, I really have used being a MAPP alum to really open up my other side. That is a caring, giving side that had been suppressed. I think that has to be a close number 2. So it's on a more personal, cathartic almost dimension, but equally important.
Fantastic. Any other questions? I have nothing in the Q&A box right now, or the chat box, or comments. All right, Otto. I think we're done here. I think your job is done. You were awesome.
Thank you very much.
You got a bravo
my
from
message
Elaine.
out there, my message out there is be well, everybody. Using these and many other tips that are going to come your way from these fantastic webinars, please take full advantage. We are an awesome MAPP alumni body, and there's much more to come. So stay tuned.